The comfortable identity you've built over decades can collapse in a single moment, like a house of cards tumbling down. A crisis strikes, medical, financial, relational. When researcher Dr. Emily Chen interviewed 66 people who experienced sudden identity disruption, she discovered something surprising. 83% reported feeling like imposters in their own lives, unable to recognize themselves or their place in the world. Today, we are examining what happens when your sense of self fractures under pressure. Through scientific research and personal narratives, we'll uncover why people respond differently to life altering changes. The answer lies in what psychologists call identity resilience, and it might be the most important skill you never knew you needed. The shattered self. How crisis rewrites your identity. What if the person you were yesterday is gone forever? This question haunts Sarah, a 38-year-old marketing executive whose life changed irrevocably on a Tuesday afternoon. She sits in a living room, photographs from a previous life surrounding her, images of mountain climbs, marathon finishes, and award ceremonies. 3 months ago, persistent numbness in her legs led to a diagnosis she never anticipated: multiple sclerosis. For 15 years, she says, I defined myself through my career achievements and physical strength. Her hands resting on legs that now occasionally fail her. She says, I was the woman who closed impossible deals during the day and ran 10 miles before breakfast. My colleagues call me the machine. She looks toward the window. Then suddenly, I couldn't predict if I'd be able to walk normally the very next day. Now, Sarah's experience illustrates how our identities exist as psychological constructs, stories we tell ourselves that can collapse without warning. These narratives form the foundation of how we understand ourselves, creating continuity between the past, present, and future. When disease, loss, or unexpected change disrupts these narratives, we experience what psychologists call identity disruption. On one side of our split screen, imagine Sarah is sitting, and on the other side, clinical psychologist Dr. Ravi Patel. Now, when something threatens your fundamental assumptions about who you are, it creates profound psychological distress. Dr. Patel explains, your brain begins reorganizing neural pathways to accommodate this new reality. Sarah nods on one side of the screen. The first 6 weeks after my diagnosis, she says, I couldn't sleep. I look in the mirror and think, who is this person? Now, Dr. Patel likens cognitive dissonance to a house built on shifting sand. He says, the foundation you've established suddenly becomes unstable. Your mind struggles to maintain structural integrity while everything beneath it moves. We glimpse brain scans showing activity in the medial prefrontal cortex during an identity crisis. This region, responsible for self-processing, becomes hyperactive when self-concept faces threats. The story I'd been telling myself no longer made any sense, Sarah says. I couldn't reconcile Sarah the unstoppable with someone who might need a walking aid. Our investigation reveals a counterintuitive finding. Individuals with rigid, clearly defined identities often experience more severe psychological consequences when those identities are challenged. We see in this elite athletes with career-ending injuries, parents whose children leave home, professionals forced into retirement. Now, Dr. Patel notes, the more singular your identity, the more devastating its disruption. So on the left side of the screen, Sarah interjects. She says, my neurologist explained that while treatments might slow progression, I might need to adapt to a new normal, I walked out feeling like I've died and I've been replaced by someone else wearing my clothes. Now, this discontinuity appears in brain activity as altered patterns in regions handling autobiographical memory. The brain struggles to connect past experiences with present circumstances, creating disconnection from one's former self. My identity crisis forced fundamental questions, Sarah explains. How much of who I am depends on what I can do? What remains when circumstances change who I am? Which parts of my self concept are essential and which ones are conditional? 3 months into her diagnosis, Sarah had begun identity reconstruction. I'm not the same person, she acknowledges, but I'm learning that identity isn't static. It constantly evolves. My capacity for resilience might ultimately become more important than my physical endurance ever was. As we conclude Sarah's story, a new question emerges. What happens when your community doesn't recognize the person you've become? When identity disruption occurs, it rarely affects only the individual. The social mirrors that once reflected our sense of self suddenly show someone we don't recognize, and sometimes neither do the people around us. The social mirror. When others don't recognize you anymore, do you know who you are when everyone keeps telling you who you should be? Let's think about Michael, 52, sits in what once was a shared living room, now half empty, after a wife of 22 years moved out. The wedding photos are gone, but faint rectangles on the wall mark where they once hung. After 2 decades defining himself as a husband and part of a couple, Michael now faces a question that leaves him staring at the ceiling at 3 a.m. in the morning. Who am I? When my wife left, I lost more than my marriage, Michael tries to explain, his voice steady but uncertain. I lost my place in the world. Our friends were couple friends, our routines were couple routines, he explains. He runs his hand across the empty space on the couch beside him, like tracing the outline of a ghost. Internally, I still feel like the same person, but no one treats me that way anymore. Now, Michael's experience reveals a very crucial aspect of identity that most of us overlook until it's completely disrupted. Our sense of self exists in a continuous feedback loop with our social environment. When his role as a husband disappeared, his entire social network recalibrated. Friends who once invited Michael and Jen now awkwardly navigated inviting just Michael, or simply stopped inviting him. Family members struggled to interact with him outside that familiar framework. This social reshuffling illuminates what researchers call the social construction of identity, the way our self concept forms through countless interactions with others. Our split screen shows Michael on one side and social psychologist Dr. Leila Wong on the other side. Your sense of self exists in a feedback loop with your community, Dr. Wong explains. When that feedback suddenly changes, it creates profound disorientation. You're losing the mirrors that reflected your identity back to you, like a boomerang or a mirror. Tajfel and Turner's social identity theory demonstrates this relationship between self-perception and group perception. We categorize ourselves into social groups, and these categorizations become part of our identity, shifting based on which groups we value most at any certain moment. At his first dinner party as a single person, going back to Michael, he felt this dissonance physically. Suddenly, I was the odd man out, he recalled. Someone actually asked if I was still the same Michael. What does that even mean? Of course I am. The reality is more complex. Group norms shape our behavior invisibly. Michael found himself making jokes his ex-wife would have appreciated. Then realizing she wasn't there to laugh, his preferences, now shared, now floated untethered into his solo life. This identity confusion intensifies online. Data shows 68% of people curate their digital presence based on the expected reactions. I couldn't figure out what to do with my social media, Michael says. Changing my status felt like erasing 20 years of my life, but not changing it felt like denial. What makes this situation revealing is how friends unconsciously reinforced his identity crisis by treating him as fundamentally changed. My friend Tom actually said, I don't know how to be friends with divorced Michael, he recounts. But I still like sci fi movies and strong opinions about pizza toppings. I just don't have a wife anymore. Now, Dr. Wong notes this reaction is common. When someone's social category changes, people often treat them as if their entire personality is transformed, accelerating identity discontinuity. Michael's experience ultimately reveals how much our identities depend on external validation rather than internal constancy. The self we experience as continuous is continuously reinforced through thousands of social interactions, confirming this is who you are. 6 months into his new life, Michael has begun to recognize how much of his identity was socially maintained and how much remains internally constant. He says, I'm learning which parts of me exist regardless of who's reflecting them back. A question emerges. How do people rebuild authentic identities after everything familiar disappears? What separates those who remain fractured from those who reconstruct stronger, more resilient senses of self? Let's talk about the Phoenix Principle, identity resilience in action. What separates those who collapse under identity threats from those who transform in one? To answer this question, we turn to Elena, who sits quietly in a garden surrounded by flowers, planted in the memory of her daughter, Sophia. 4 years ago, Sophia died in a car accident at age 16. The loss represents perhaps the most severe identity disruption possible. The death of a child fundamentally altered Elena's perception of herself as a mother and protector. She says, I was Sophia's mom. That was the core of who I was for 16 years. Her voice steady despite the weight of her words. When she died, I lost my daughter, the person I had become, the future I had imagined, and the daily routines that structured my very existence. Now, she touches a pendant containing Sophia's photo. She says people would say, you're still a mother, but everything that defined motherhood in my daily life was gone. Elena's experience raises a profound question about identity resilience. We examine cases of identity disruption across various circumstances, from Sarah's medical diagnosis to Michael's divorce. Now we face the ultimate puzzle. Why do some people never recover from identity threats while others eventually construct even stronger, more authentic identities? Now, research on parental bereavement offers insight into this question. Parents who experience child loss engage in three key processes: sense making, benefit finding, and identity reconstruction. Sense making involves creating a framework to understand the loss, while benefit finding involves recognizing potential value in the experience. Identity reconstruction requires adapting to new roles and finding new ways to express one's self concept. Now, the first year after Sophia's death, Elena experienced what she calls identity annihilation, like destruction. Like a garden devastated by frost, her sense of self withered. She says, I couldn't function as a person I was before. I felt like a ghost moving through a life that no longer made any sense. Now, Elena's journey toward rebuilding herself illuminates the critical mechanisms of post traumatic growth that experts like Dr. Marcus Johnson study. He says, identity resilience isn't about preserving who you are. It's about integrating the traumatic event into a new, coherent self-narrative. Those who struggle most are often trying to return to a self that no longer exists, rather than building something new. Now, this insight aligns with the research showing that parents who experience child loss often describe themselves as fundamentally changed, feeling unrecognizable compared to their former selves and identities. The loss disrupts both personal and their social identity. Their sense of belonging to groups and communities, they all change. Elena describes such a turning point. About 18 months after Sophia died, I realized I couldn't go back to who I was before, but I could build something new that honored both my loss and my continued existence. Now, for her, this realization marked the beginning of post traumatic identity growth. For Elena, establishing a scholarship foundation in Sophia's name allowed her to practice narrative flexibility, which is incorporating her trauma into a meaningful new chapter. When students receive Sophia's scholarship, Elena reads their thank you letters at the garden bench where she once helped Sophia with homework, creating continuity between past and present roles. She says helping others gave me a new purpose. It didn't replace being Sophia's mom, but created a new dimension to that old identity. Like planting new seeds in familiar soil, became someone who could transform my worst experience into something that actually mattered. Now, our investigation revealed specific resilience building techniques which Elena is using, maintaining core values while adapting roles, creating meaning through helping others, and developing what we call narrative flexibility. Now, Dr. Johnson emphasizes that social support is crucial. He says identity reconstruction doesn't happen in isolation. Those who successfully rebuild typically have communities that validate both their loss and also their continued existence. Now, as Elena puts it, she says, I'm not the same person I was before Sophia died, but parts of me that truly mattered, as in my capacity for love, creativity, determination, remain, just expressed in very new ways. What is our conclusion? Our stories have revealed something fundamental about human identity. It isn't something fixed that we possess from birth to death. Identity is something we actively construct through continuous integration of our experiences, both the ones we choose and those thrust upon us without any warning. This ongoing narrative requires flexibility, resilience, and sometimes complete reconstruction. Now, my logical retreat system creates a stabilizing mirror for your identity by distilling your roles, values, and purposes into one coherent page that withstands life's disruptions. By clarifying what truly matters in your life, you establish an enduring foundation. To check it out, look up logicalretreat.com. Now, going back to Dr. Patel, he concludes the question isn't whether your identity will be challenged, but whether you'll have the tools to rebuild when it happens. I hope and pray that if you've been through loss and bereavement, such as the examples we spoke about, that you'll be able to rebuild your life meaningfully in a way that works for you and rebuild an identity which actually fulfills you but connects you still to the past. Thank you.